At Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from 44 allied and associate countries arrived for the opening of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference.
The year was 1944, and the delegates had come to the conference to revive economies across the globe, wiped out by World War II. So these delegates drew up plans for a pair of global institutions. The World Bank was created here to loan money to needy countries far away, and the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, was also formed to spur global trade, mainly by managing exchange rates. Hard to imagine the bank and fund would ever be blamed for squelching growth, and yet better must come, a fitting anthem for the poor island nation of Jamaica, given its recent past.
I see the rich getting richer and the poor dying.
Poet Muta Baruka recorded the hit economic rap Better Must Come to blast politicians for borrowing money they now had to pay back with interest.
You keep borrowing money from the IMF and the World Bank in the people's name, continuing the oppression of black people by the same colonialist masters. Why you can't learn?
To Jamaicans like Muta Baruka and others, the IMF has come to represent oppression, though the fund will tell you it's just been trying to do its job, keep the Jamaican economy alive and kicking. The conflict is over the IMF's role, which has evolved during the decades from managing exchange rates to providing emergency loans to poor countries in economic crisis. The IMF has become the developing world's lender of last resort. But in return for its loans, it has demanded economic changes in places like Jamaica, supposedly to spur growth and avoid economic crises in the future.
The kinds of reforms that we are encouraging Jamaica to implement, and the World Bank, are reforms that would increase the growth in the economy, increase its productive potential, and in that way provide the domestic resources so that they can deal with the poverty that exists in that country.
Such reforms were meant to foster stability and growth. Just what the 184 countries that contribute to it want the IMF to do with the $120 billion or so it has to lend. But if the loans can't be paid back, the fund says it won't have money for the next borrower, the next crisis. So, to make sure it gets its money back, the IMF sets conditions on the loans. Economic reforms that it says lead to economic discipline and ultimately growth. They are: encourage exports to earn money in the global marketplace, discourage imports that drain money from the economy, stop the presses, the ones that print money, that is. Printing money can lead to runaway inflation, privatize inefficient state-owned businesses, cut deficit spending by government, and keep paying your debts. But all these reforms, and especially debt repayment, have proved to be harsh medicine for poor countries like Jamaica. This is Kingston, Jamaica's capital. For years, the minister to the poorest of the poor, Father Richard Albert.
You're Tony Moscow's sister?
Yes, sir. I would like to come and see you Thursday.
Yeah, man, you come Thursday. Yeah, and we'll talk, yeah.
Yes, sir.
You have to remember that the vast majority of these people are terribly, terribly poor, and survival's the name of the game. And this whole problem of the debt crisis, the whole struggle of the debt, is lived out on this street.
How so?
Well, when the government doesn't have enough money to pay the debt, they take it from social services. And so that housing, health, employment opportunities, all of those are almost non-existent.
Nearly half of every dollar the government of Jamaica spends already goes to pay interest on the debt, while 35% of Jamaicans live below the poverty line. In one Kingston neighborhood, built on a working garbage dump, kids gather while a notorious fugitive hides nearby amidst the rubble.
You see Nati around? No. I'm glad you didn't either. He's out there somewhere.
The dream for these kids? To get a gun. Crime has arguably been the fastest growing industry in the country, which leads critics to charge that the IMF reform of cutting government spending is too costly, if not counterproductive. And there have been other problems with the IMF's list of do's and don'ts for Jamaica. Both the fund and the government wanted people here to buy Jamaican. As it happened, they had their work cut out for them. There was and is a deep bias among Jamaicans against any goods made in their own country. Jamaican factory owner Anthony Robinson.
A garment manufacturer a couple of years ago made up some garments, placed all of them same style. One batch had a label made in the USA, the other batch had a label made in Jamaica. Placed them in the same shop. Different price tags, one $5, the one made in the US, $5 more expensive than the one made in Jamaica. The batch made in the US was sold off and reordered before the batch made in Jamaica could be moved. And they were all made by the same person, same style, same everything.
Why?
Because it's made foreign, and if it's foreign, it's better.
Ironically then, the very globalization that the IMF represents has spurred Jamaicans to buy imports, which reduced the money that could have been used to pay down the deficit. On the other hand, what were the alternatives to the IMF reforms? Opting out of the global market entirely? Or, say, leaving the country's assets, like the tourism industry, in the hands of the government? Butch Stewart runs the Sandals Resort.
Because I'm a hard believer that free enterprise is the only way. I've seen the aspects of it at work, and I've seen the aspects of state operations and control that don't work.
Stewart took over Sandals when it was a state-owned, money-losing hotel and made it profitable. More than 300 Jamaicans are now employed here. Private enterprise, says Stewart, not only puts money in people's pockets, it also teaches marketable skills. Liebert Bernard is a 27-year-old waiter.
When I came here, I didn't know nothing. I started in the corner there after breakfast in the morning for approximately 2 hours in the morning. Learn how to set the table, put on water glass, what side to serve from, food from the left, beverage from the right, all those things.
In a country where the unemployment rate is over 15%, even a menial job can unleash powerful ambitions and perhaps lead to new businesses and more jobs.
I don't want to work all the days of my life working for people, you know. I want to work so I can employ people. More business is better, so you can employ more people, less unemployment.
Liebert Bernard would seem to be a poster boy for free market reforms, a vindication of the IMF policy of globalization. And yet, decades after the IMF began making reforms a condition of its loans, Jamaica is actually poorer than it was before conditionality. But is that because of failed IMF policies? Or because Jamaica's is a desperate economy which has to swallow some bitter pills?
There's no easy thing because there are winners and losers.
We sat down with the IMF's former chief economist, Ken Rogoff, now back to teaching economics. Suppose, he said, a state-run company is hemorrhaging money.
You'd like to keep the company going. Somebody's going to lose their job. On the other hand, the country is going to collapse in a year. How do you trade these things off? And they're tough decisions, and they're not easy to escape at some level. The political elite in the country has to make them. Sometimes they call on the international community, they call on places like the IMF and the World Bank to give them a little political cover for what they have to do.
And that, say those who defend the fund, is why poor countries like Jamaica can get loans from the IMF and then blame it at the same time.
Part of what the IMF does is give advice, but part of it is you point at the IMF, do exactly what you had to do. You had to slash the budget because nobody will lend you money anymore. And the IMF provides that whipping boy, and that really is part of its role.
The whipping boy, says Rogoff, for critics like economist Michael Winter in the popular film Life and Debt, which chronicles Jamaica's decades-long struggle with the IMF.
The economy today is much more under the control of foreigners, not necessarily through direct ownership, but through the mechanism of debt. In the 1970s, we owed $800 million. By the end of the 1980s, we owed $4 billion. Nowadays, we owe $7 billion. So the debt is rising, and all the time the debt is rising, our capacity to export, to produce, is getting less.
At the end of the day, though, the main question this film suggests is not an easy one to answer. Without the IMF and World Bank, would the Jamaican economy have been better off or even worse?